To begin with, I'm sure you have some questions, but let me first explain why I'm videotaping this. I've done quite a number of these workshops, and every year I'm trying to find better ways to say things, you know. And another thing, a lot of students can't come to my workshops because I have classes the next day. So therefore they often ask if they can get a transcript of what I'm actually saying here. And I'm right now preparing a lot of the content of the workshop in a little book form or something, you know. But when I go back to Denmark over the summer, you sit there in a totally different environment, Danish thinking, which is totally unlike American thinking, and you can't even remember how Americans think on these issues, quite often at least. So to sort of stay in touch with how Americans feel, I have now decided to videotape some of my workshops, so when I go back I can better write this thing. And learn from my mistakes, of course, also. Then another thing is, it's what I'm doing here is basically a way of trying to raise your awareness about your racism. It's not going to do anything to affect your racism. Intellectually you'll understand it maybe better, but to really change anything you need to go to be more in touch with, I talked a little bit about this yesterday, the deeper pain we have as a result of our mistreatment in such a society. And that's where Tony Harris, my friend who couldn't come down here today, he comes in and usually follows up my more theoretical workshop with a deeply emotional workshop. And it's too bad that he couldn't make it, but his meeting yesterday lasted until 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Lansing. And what came out of it was that they decided to, in the medical school up there, to use American Pictures and his workshops for all the freshman students in the medical school every year. So it was a very important meeting, you know. All of them had to be forced through this whole thing here. And that's an idea for you to work on in this campus. You know. I do a lot of freshman orientation shows around the country. They're good because they're going to be there. Right now, it's voluntary to go to the show, and it means only those people who are already interested in this issue will come. And often the people who are forced to go are the ones who get most affected by it, so it's a shame that they won't come voluntarily. Well, I don't know what you have of questions here to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a question that just I thought about for a long time with regards to mostly black-white relations, and not really having any. At least I don't figure that I really have any of the black experience in me. That I don't really know how to go about looking at this question. But when looking at the vast inequalities between blacks and whites in our society, and you know, when thinking about, you know, well, how can these, you know, how can we move toward resolving these issues? What I always come up against, at least in my mind, is well, there's so much of what is brought up by people you know, who mean only the very best, seem to be things that are, in effect, designed to make black people white, you know, and don't look and see the situation as, well, here's whites, and here's, you know, our, you know, general, you know, cultural traits and this and that, and here's what we do in society, and you know, here's the things you can generalize about black people and stuff like that. And so much of, you know, it seems like social programs and everything like that is designed to take the blacks and bring them over here, you know, with us, and have them do things like us, and learn like us, and work like us, and think like us.
Yeah.
And what about more like something like that? Which is of course much more difficult because you have to move the status quo. But when thinking really thinking about what can we do, and what kinds of things should I be thinking of and doing as an individual? So much of it seems like is dealing with the inequalities that way, and that doesn't sound. I don't like the sound of that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, you're already tying several issues into it here, but it's obvious that this is a classical blame the victim situation where you want to change the victim in order to integrate it into society, to make it more acceptable for the rest of society or whatever. And we should never forget that racism is one very important aspect of racism is not being able to accept differences. That means not accepting those people who have been hurt by our racism, and of course they're going to be different from ourselves,
Well,
but still there's some validity in the approach. If you, instead of saying white, changing them into be white, say changing them into being accepted by mainstream America, what we call the melting pot or whatever, then it gets a slightly different tone. There is one of the disturbing things I see in America is that almost all foreign immigrants who come here, including Africans, who often come here with deep racial solidarity toward the blacks, but they come here and then what they see in America, they don't understand either, no more than we do. So all kinds of forces very fast put them in on the white side of this apartheid spectrum. And here I prefer to say mainstream America. If you look at the recent statistics of immigrants coming in from Asia and so on, you'll find that I saw a recent statistic where 60% of Japanese who come here intermarry. 50 or 40% of most other groups intermarry into other groups in society outside that group, But among black Americans, the figure remains 2% who are able to intermarry now. Now, I'm not saying that this is a solution or anything, but it is a measure of how the different groups are accepted into mainstream America. In Denmark, where I come from, the racism is not so much, it's not primarily toward black Americans, they're very popular over there, but toward Iranians, Arabs, and so on. In America, I found that Iranians immediately melt in on the white side of this apartheid spectrum. But over there, that's the worst for us, So the psychology of different societies is, of course, different.
Well, so how do we...
Well, I'll get back to all this later in my presentation here, so I think I'll tie it into to this. So you start with a heavy question. Don't you have any easy ones? Well, that means it's a serious school, this one. I go to some lesser competitive schools, and the first question I get, how did you make it into the Rockefellers, and why did you beard so long, or whatever. That's the main focus for them. Of course, you get afraid of asking that kind of question. You can ask any question. You had a question.
Well, I guess I sort of have a question about how your journey, like when you went to different places, like how you found from going from one extreme to such a different extreme, and how you, that must have been so difficult to just go from one place to another, trying, when you're learning all these things and trying to, with the photographs that you took, it's very intense, just from going to one space to the other.
Well, I found it the thrill of traveling in America. I just never could get tired of these differences on a daily basis. I think very few places in the world could you move so fast between some of the richest people in the world and some of the poorest people in the world. So of course, when I started in the black community on the poor side, for a while, and then came back to the affluent whites who didn't give a damn about the people in the ghetto, I could feel some resentment. But very soon it was replaced with a sense of pity for those people who lived in this great isolation from other people in society. And also trying to understand how they had ended up like this. So another thing which I did talk a little bit about in my show yesterday was when I was with white people, I always started thinking racist. You know, looking with their eyes back on a ghetto, I started thinking racist. I couldn't help it. I mean, that's the way you became racist anyway. But so therefore, it was so important for me to go back into the ghetto and live with people there. And I never felt that when I lived there, because we know how, as a result of oppression, the black intellect is geared in a totally different direction in this society. So those things you in white society look at blacks, that makes you racist when you look at them falling behind in the school system and so on. Well, very soon you realize that here's a total different emphasis on the way intellect is being used, clearly as a result of oppression. And then when you understand how sophisticated forms people can express themselves in within that framework, then it's then you simply couldn't think racist like this. But we'll get back to this later. I don't know if I answered the question. There's so many things tied into this, so
When you were driving across the country in certain situations, we saw you a very racist person, a very closed-minded person. Did you ever try confronting those people about their racism? Or I can tell that at certain times it wouldn't have been a good idea.
Yeah. Basically, the first thing you shouldn't talk, or the last thing you should talk to them about when you feel that they're very racist, is race, or blacks, or color, or whatever the phobia is. You know. First of all, we should never forget that that's not really the source of their pain. It goes much deeper. And again, I'll come back to this a little bit later because I'll answer it in my presentation here. So, well, let me give you an example. I was traveling through Tennessee and picked up a hitchhiker. I had my son with me in the car, and I was going down to somewhere in Florida, but we were passing through Atlanta, and we picked up this poor white hitchhiker with lots of tattoos, and you know, the type nobody picks up because they look too violent, you know. We got him in the car. All he had was a little box with cassette tapes and so on. And when we passed through Atlanta, I wanted my son to see Martin Luther King's grave, so I asked this person here if he wanted to come with us in, and he immediately said, I don't care for them people. And then it just blew me away like this, you know, the force it came with. So he was obviously deeply racist. But I felt, well, he has to get out of the car. So I forced him to stand outside the car in a very low-income, so-called bad neighborhood right outside Martin Luther King's grave, you know. So he was forced to be with those people he didn't really care about, you know. But that was still better for him than going in to see Martin Luther King's grave. Anyway, later I got him in a car, and I knew the last thing I should talk to him about was race. You know, I was not going to put any trip on him. But I felt there must be a way of reaching him. And I know from my traveling, you can always reach such hurt people. And so I started talking about he was totally tied up, you know, stiff and wouldn't open up, and like so many of those people are. And so I asked him to start, or asked him questions about his music. I could see that was everything he really had in his world. He was so proud of his music, cassette tapes and so on. And I asked him to play some of it. And I listened and I asked interesting questions. That was not easy for me because it was heavy rock music I couldn't stand. But I really pretended to be very, very interested. You know. I was interested, let me say that one. And little by little, as I asked these questions, the more he opened up, he started feeling proud that somebody took an interest in his life, you know. And I could just see how he little by little grew. And then I started asking questions about himself and his childhood, and sure enough it turned out that he had been viciously beaten by his father in childhood. And but of course, like so many other people, you end up growing up defending your father and your family and so on, and say things like, I sure deserved a good beating, that kind of stuff, you know. And then he has never dealt with his anger, his unhealed anger. So therefore he misplaced it out on blacks. It could have been anybody, homosexuals, Jews, women, whatever, you know. But so often you find that those most hurt by racist oppression, it has nothing to do with blacks. It goes to a much deeper source of pain, their mistreatment by their parents, you know. People who suffered incest, for instance, are very likely to end up a severe racist unless they've had a chance to heal their anger. Alcoholists and other people and all kinds of people who have been mistreated by child abuse and so on. And that includes a lot of poor whites in this country here. So, but we should never forget that blacks have nothing to do with their pain. They just focus it out in that direction. I'll get back to this a little bit later. Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you explain racist whites who've had like every advantage, including the family and the economic welfare and stuff has all been taken care of, and yet they still have this hatred toward blacks where you can see nothing, and neither can they, that gives any indication that they've been mistreated?
Well, we have all been mistreated by growing up in a totally irrational society which no child can understand. A society where very early, no matter how much your parents have told you to love everybody around you and so on, the children are going to get the messages about them people over there somewhere, they're different from us, you know. And of course a child growing up in such deep isolation from others, you know, simply don't understand it. And eventually, if they can't sort it out intellectually and understand it, they are going to develop some hatred because they've been forced all the childhood in that direction. A lot of what we saw in the Old South under slavery, you know, where they were playing with black children in the slave homes, you know. But still, they got all the messages about them being different from us. And so when they grew up, they ended up justifying slavery. And a lot of them ended up hating blacks, also loving blacks. It was a very strange thing. Let me get back into it later with what I call liberal racism. Any more questions? Let me just see if this machine is working. Yeah, it doesn't like American electricity. It still works. So I'll try, since you're already very serious about this, I'll try to give a description of how we become racist by starting with making a drawing of our mind here at birth in any society. It could be your mind right now after seeing the show. You know, it's empty. But basically, this is a mind we have at birth when we are ready to be filled up with all kinds of information from whatever society we grow up in, the human intelligence or whatever. And all this information flows in here in a steady stream from the outside, through eyes, ears, perceptions and so on. First from our parents, later from the whole environment we live in. And then we try to sort it out, understand it in here. And once we understand the information we get as children, we then store it out here in our memory boxes. In those boxes where we feel that this bit of information belongs in. Almost like a computer, you know, bits of information. So in the future, when we have new similar events happening to us, we can immediately go out here and find the bits and pieces we need to now solve the new problem with in a wise way, in a logical way, in a way that makes sense. This is what is so beautiful about the human mind, our enormous capacity for flexible thinking, unlike a computer. It can only work in certain programmed ways. But the problem we have is that most of us can't do this very well, because so early in our childhood we get hurt. The first hurt, let me give a description of a hurt. We were 2 years old, 1, 2, 3 years old. We were sitting in the living room with our mother, our father, not to be sexist here. And it was a beautiful game or play between mother and child, and it seemed like this could go on forever. But all of a sudden the telephone rang, and there was a disturbing message for the mother. Loss of a job, maybe illness, death in the family, something the child didn't understand. And a few minutes after, the mother comes back deeply distressed, in pain, in anger maybe, totally upset and angry and so on. And out of her own anger she might now slap the child who expected this play to continue. And what happened to us at that time? We started crying. We got hurt. But crying was a very good reaction to this hurt, because when we cry, we somehow make sure that the information we get from such a distress experience doesn't jam up in here. When we cry, we can discharge our pain and still eventually sort it out here in our memory boxes. But what I very soon found, especially in poor white homes and poor black homes, was a tendency to slap the children or to further hurt them once they start crying. Don't cry, don't be sissy, grow up, be a man. Here we see some of the roots of sexism also, how we eventually can hardly cry as men when we grow older. This is where the worst damage comes in, when we're punished in a process of getting rid of our pain. Then all kinds of damage happens to us. The whole thinking machinery shuts down. We can't process this information. It gets stuck in here in a big tied up knot of unprocessed information. Later in life, when we have similar experiences that sort of relate to that earlier hurt information or hurt experience, we can't now find the bits and pieces out here we need to understand those new problems with. No, it comes up in a big tied up knot of this unprocessed, angry, emotional information. Some of us, if we have just lost our girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, we know, all of us, we know how if you had to write a paper right after, you just can't think clearly. This is this whole tied up knot of hurt and pain that sort of runs our mind. We simply can't think very well. And this is what happens to everybody who has been hurt. The more hurt and abuse we go through, the less well can we think in clear ways. Talking about racism here, all whites have been deeply hurt by racism. And when they see the show there, for instance, some people have been deeply hurt by it. When you see the show, it's not actually what is being said in the show that is most important, but the show sort of forces a lot of you to think back on memories you had from childhood and messages you got from your parents. And suddenly something like this, a deep hurt from childhood, might come up and run your mind. And therefore I see people who are otherwise very rational, well-adjusted, sometimes they come running out from the show, screaming and yelling and acting weird, And this is actually because they can't think, they can't look, find the pieces out here. This whole thing comes up and runs their mind,
You said just now again, being hurt by racism.
I'll get back to this now. Okay.
Well, if you're going to talk about this, we just stop.
Yeah, I'll talk about it.
Okay.
I'll get to it, because I was trying to give a more general psychological description of how we get hurt. I think all of you who have some intuitive understanding of psychology knows that this is basically what is going on. This is tied together all forms of psychiatry and psychology, whatever. Anyway, as we get older, we get more and more hurt by all kinds of experiences in life. And finally, when we get old, we become a walking, chronic distress pattern. We can only act out in ways from all this hurt here. We can't think very well about things around us. Americans, for instance, have been deeply hurt by a violent society. So they end up voting for capital punishment and things that in other societies would never even think of. You know, we become rigid in our thinking. You know it from old people, your grandparents, perhaps you come to their homes and every little pot plant and nip thing has to be standing exactly there. If you move them 1 inch, they get deeply upset. We lose flexibility and you know, flexible thinking as we grow older. And then eventually we, when we become weird and rigid in our ways, and young people are not so rigid, so they say to their parents or grandparents, look how ridiculous you are, you know. And they will defend themselves and say, that's the way I am. That's not the way they are. That's the way they've been oppressed to become. So anyway, this model here we now sort of understand intuitively. Let's translate it now to the issue of racism. And when I now talk about racism, try in your own mind to connect it to homophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, and all the other cousins we have. It's very similar. When I talk about how do we become racist, I find it usually easiest to start with those racists who seem worse than ourselves, you know, because you don't even think of yourself as being racist, right? No. So let's start with old-fashioned bigot in the South, or did you see Mississippi Burning? That type of ridiculous racist, you know. How did they become that way? Well, we know that nobody was born that way. A child in any society is born with an open, loving mind until we hurt them. How did they get hurt? Well, probably very early in their upbringing, they heard these messages from, or statements from their parents like, niggers are dirty, or don't play with the children down the road, they will stab you. This is totally irrational, insane information for the open-minded, loving, zestful child we have in all societies to begin with. They don't understand it. Simply, children don't see in color or sexual preferential groups or ethnic groups or religious groups or whatever until we hurt them like this. Niggers are dirty, what does it really mean? Something I noticed in all the homes I lived in was that blacks certainly was as much as whites do. Whenever I got any diseases in these, you saw all the homes I lived in the South, you know, in some of those homes. Now, whenever I got diseases like fleas, crabs, lice, or whatever you could catch up in those days, you know, it was always in white homes, actually. Certain hippie homes that didn't always was so well. But in any case, and children don't stab. So both of these statements are totally irrational. The child doesn't understand them. So when it doesn't understand this information, it gets the thinking machine shuts down momentarily while it's being heard. And all this misinformation then jams up in here. They can't sort it out here. And later, as they grow older, they are now oppressed with new hurtful information from their parents and the whole illogical apartheid-like society they grow up in. So gradually, it ties down more and more of their mind like this. And one day, when they grow older, or grow up, or even old, they end up maybe looking, sounding like, and acting like you remember this pickup truck driver I had an interview with my show, who was talking about niggers here, niggers there all the time. You remember him, right? how did he become that way? He had, of course, been deeply hurt in his upbringing by being oppressed with all this information. When he picked me up, I was standing out there in Alabama on the side roads with my sign saying, touring USA from Denmark. He had no idea what I was doing in America. I didn't know myself what I was doing in America at that time. But yet, the first question he asked me when he got me in the car was, are there any niggers in Denmark? And then without even waiting for an answer, he started rambling off these sentences about nigger, 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 nigger. I immediately got my tape recorder up because I knew that was the voice of history I heard there. The sentences had been oppressed on generation after generation of white, innocent children growing up in the South, finally tying up their minds so they couldn't think independently anymore. He had lost his mind to racism. Any little incident, I mean, there was nothing there that had with blacks to do. I mean, me, a white person standing out there, but any little thing could trigger this whole hurt there from his childhood to come up and run him, just like a record in a jukebox comes up and then runs your mind with these programmed messages or statements you have heard all your life. He couldn't think freely any longer. Such a person has been deeply hurt. And if such a person has not only been hurt by racist oppression, but also by classist oppression, then they're in danger. If they're grown up as poor whites and been told, and from mainstream whites, such as you, for instance, that you're poor white trash, you're good for nothing, you're bigots, you're rednecks, you're crackers, all these terrible things we tell poor whites. And their children, of course, pick it up, you know. Then they end up having so much unhealed anger that one day they'll take their anger out on some people in society in a more violent way, and maybe join the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazi groups. And what do we do then, us who are more liberal? We further oppress them. It's obvious that they are sick people, and sick people we shouldn't oppress. They need help. What we really should do, of course, when we see them burn crosses and say nigger, 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 and we get offended. But we don't need to isolate them and further reject them, because it was out of that rejection their anger grew in the first place. So we need to make them our allies. What does that mean? To constantly, in our behavior and relationship with them, reach into that human being which has not yet been destroyed in here. There is such a human being in all of us, no matter how hurt we've been. Even the most violent junkie, I found I could always, on some level, reach into. By giving them their attention, their love, their affection, Christian love, whatever you'll call it, which they did not receive in their upbringing, it is so easy to help them to feel good about themselves or feel better about themselves. And people who feel good about themselves have no need to go out and trash other people out there. Only people in deep pain are able to trash other people, victimize other people. So if we could help them to feel better about themselves and that was so easy for me as a vagabond, because I had all the time in the world to listen to their pain, their frustration, and just help them to feel that there was something by giving them recognition and asking them questions about their childhood and so on. Something, an interest nobody had maybe ever shown them before. It is so easy to help to steer them away from an otherwise destructive course. And thus, we make society less oppressive for the target groups of their anger, the blacks, the Jews, the women, the homosexuals, and other vulnerable groups in society. But most of us forget it, and we tend to further oppress them, make them feel even worse about themselves. Who's the greatest oppressor in the world? Who can you think of? Hitler, right? If we can understand Hitler, I think we can understand anybody in this world. how did Hitler become this way? Well, Alice Miller have anybody read her books? Austrian psychologist, who's very famous right now. She's done a great study of the oppression of children. And in one of her books she writes about the oppression of Hitler in his childhood. When you see the account of how he was beaten up and hurt and neglected and abused by his parents, especially his father, everybody around him, and then what happened later in his childhood, you clearly see how he was forced from this oppressed child into the role as an ultimate oppressor. Any oppressor has always been going through a severe form of oppression first, and is then manipulated into the oppressor role. But Alice Miller also says something very interesting. If Hitler had had just one person in his childhood he could turn to, such as a loving aunt, grandmother, loving stranger, who would give him some affection, attention, that whole process would have been interrupted. This is what she calls a saving angel. See, most abused children do have one such person they can turn to. Any of us, she says, can act out and become saving angels toward hurt, abused children. Right now we see a tremendous growth in America of hurt and abused children around us. And if you want to fight oppression, you don't wait until those people have become Ku Klux Klan members or gangsters or criminals in the ghettos, No, you reach out to them right now and fight oppression. You do your homework. Become saving angels for those children to avoid that one day they'll end up in prison. That's in your own self-interest. But most of us, when we think of fighting oppression, we think of going out there and shooting at the Klan or something. We simply end up in such situations because we did not do our homework. Anyway, this is sort of the idea of oppression, the worst aspects of oppression, the Ku Klux Klan, the Hitler type and so on. Most of us do not look that bad. So let me now talk about the more liberal form of racist and how we became that way. Because as I said yesterday, it was not the Ku Klux Klan who had a great impact on blacks in America. That was done by the more liberal whites. We are the ones who hold blacks out of good jobs, who discriminate them in health, education, housing, and force them into ghettos and so on. The blacks and the Ku Klux Klan never had that type of power for the most part. So it's clear that we had to work on our racism, and first of all, we had to understand it. How did we become racist? Well, probably our parents did not tell us overtly hurtful stuff like niggers are dirty. They were more liberal. They would bombard us with lofty ideals of American creed, American liberty, equality, and land of opportunities, and all these beautiful slogans all societies have up here. And the emphasis being on liberty and dignity and equality for everyone. But whenever the topic came to inner city, slums, blacks, homosexuals, hitchhikers, to go a step further, they would change their tone a little bit, lift their eyebrows, and thereby give the hidden statement to the child that some people are not so equal as others. And this was completely as damaging for us, and caused our thinking machinery to shut down. When you're being told always that everybody's equal and we're all the same and so on, and then you see your parents in so many ways send the message out to you that some people are not so equal, you don't understand this information. Your whole thinking machinery shuts down. You can't process it. This is how we all ended up racist in America. Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish anthropologist, came over here in the 40s to do a big study of American race relations, and came to the conclusion that all Americans, black or white for that matter, have these double standards. They hold on to these lofty ideals, but deep down in their guts they develop the feeling that some people are not so equal as others. And they've never been able to reconcile that gap. So when we are around those people whom we feel are basically not so equal as others, we can only act out in guilt patterns toward them. And guilt, as blacks will tell you, is the worst form of racism. They can't stand patronizing attitudes. And us who are more liberal, racist, we constantly act out in guilt patterns without even knowing it when we're around blacks. One example of such a liberal racist, one white woman I had in Smith College was talking about how in childhood her father, she lived in D.C. at the time, Washington D.C., where there's a lot of blacks, and sometimes he would drive her through the city while she was still a child. And when she saw all those crack dealers or winos or street people stand out on the street corners, she would sometimes burst out some racist slurs. And her father, a good liberal, would then immediately hit the brakes, turn around and look at her with a stern face and not drive on until she had apologized. Because this was not good tone in a liberal family to come with that kind of sentences, racist slurs. However, years later, when she grew up and one day brought home a black boyfriend, the whole message was a different one. So see, all the time she had been drilled with these hidden messages that some people are not so equal as others. And she never understood that information. Her thinking machine was shut down, and therefore she was trying to act out her pain. All children everywhere in the world are being oppressed. And therefore they act out their pain in so many irrational ways in the eyes of their parents. Children are always impossible in the eyes of their parents, and they act out their pain in so many ways. And for her it came out in, at least on the racial level, in these racist slurs. Well, you know, I don't know how many of you have been blasted drunk. I'm pretty sure most of you have. You also know how many of you, if you've been blasted drunk, how many of you have not had racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic slurs on your lips at least. Now, you're very good liberals, so you've probably learned to control that unhealed anger, never to come out in the open, certainly not in a university atmosphere. But you know that you have them on your lips. And that basically shows how close we are to the Ku Klux Klan. It is completely the same unhealed anger we're trying to get out of the system. Most campuses these days I go to, they've had recent racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Semitic attacks. And most of us who see those things, or see these things written on toilet doors, and we get a little offended. And we tend to isolate such people. But here again, as I said earlier, don't ever isolate such people who are victimizing others. Sure, it's not nice to see them, but they're not very different from you. Reach out, give them your friendship, your help, don't necessarily talk about the issues that are hurting them there, but give them all the love you can, you know, and thereby help them to feel better about themselves. As I said before, people who feel good about themselves have no need to go out and trash others. So, it's just I feel something we should never forget on any campus. You can help to make campus a less oppressive place to be for the minorities if you end up reaching out to the racist, the sexist, the homophobes, or whatever we have around. We are all in deep pain, and this pain has been growing in society the last 10 years, I have noticed, and therefore we see a tremendous increase in racist attacks all over the place. Anyway, I'll now get to the oppression of black children, but let us now first talk whether we grow up old-fashioned bigots or we go through the liberal form of racism, which most of us went through. The damage is pretty much the same. And some people who work on these levels, they come with the conclusion that maybe as a result of all this oppression, we only have 10% left of our original intelligence to operate with on a functional level. The rest is tied down in these hurt and anger patterns. We can't think very well as a result. And this is for the successful adult whites in America. That might include many of you here. You might not have more than 10% left to operate with. We know a lot of poor whites are in deep pain. We see them constantly when they get into bars, end up in fights, where in the same situation we can walk in and never get into any fight. Such people have a hard time making it into schools like Kenyon College. They are in deep pain. We're talking here about hurt intellect. So now let me just check this thing here again. I think it's good. I told you earlier why I was taking this, so I don't need to say. Let me now talk about the oppression of black children in this society. Here the damage is far worse, of course. First of all, black children go through a double form of racism. The first one they get is the most easy one to understand, the overt racism. We now understand what that is. That is the unhealed anger from us. They constantly perceive and feel around wherever they go. The guilt, fear patterns they get from you on campuses like this. The statements they hear, see written around and so on. You know, all black children very early perceive that from society. They grow up on the wrong side of the tracks in the South. From day one they know that everything about them is wrong. When they see themselves grow up in dilapidated housing and see whites live over there in these nice homes and see the hostile glare of whites when they walk into the downtown section and so on. Or they grow up on the south side of Chicago, see millions of blacks around them, never a white face, until they turn on the TV and they realize whites are all over in power in this society here. Deeply damaging for the self-esteem of a black child growing up. But that more overt racism is not necessarily the worst today. No, there's another more vicious aspect to it called internalized racism. Internalized racism, to understand it, let me just say, wherever in the world we have a group being oppressed, the members of that group will then further internalize the views of their oppressor and help to further drag each other down in oppression, hurt each other, and instill these values in each other. Women know it very well. As a result of sexist oppression, women everywhere in the world are the best examples of people telling each other that the woman's places in a home, in a kitchen, don't take male power in society and so on. We have millions of Phyllis Schlafly's anywhere in the world telling people or further dragging women down in sexist oppression. Let me give some similar examples from racist oppression or internalized racism. We had a lot of examples in the second part of the show yesterday. One thing I noticed everywhere in underclass homes, I heard these fights between adults who would say things like, "You ain't shit, nigger," which immediately is perceived by the black child. In other words, they hear, "You ain't you're worse than dirt," from early childhood. Constantly, "You're worse than dirt," reverberating white society's low opinions of them. Our black students who go to elite schools like this one here, it is very painful, very difficult to adjust to all this white power all of a sudden. If you've been shaped by a ghetto environment or a black environment, black culture. And a lot of black students are not capable of adjusting to it, especially since they don't get your help. So the black attrition rates in these integrated schools is enormous. But if they are capable of adjusting to these white institutions here, they are often, when they come home to their homes, the black ghettos and so on, often ridiculed for now acting white, thinking white, being called Oreo cookies by fellow blacks. I don't know if you saw Spike Lee's School Days, because this is a classical example of internalized racism, how blacks end up hurting fellow blacks who go to these schools and so on. A very sad example I had in Baltimore recently, when a black student was telling me how his girlfriend had just been accepted into an elite school. When time came to start school, and she had been given a big scholarship, but when time came to start school, she found out her mother had now spent all the money on herself. When she confronted her mother, because now she felt her whole future was denied her, the mother snapped back at her and said, "You shouldn't go to that white school anyway. You should be proud of your own people. You should stay close to home, etc., etc., etc." You know, a very sad example of how you end up hurting our fellow blacks and dragging yourself down in further racist oppression. I hope you now see the model here. We have thousands of examples of it, and we see that in every oppressed group in the world. One classical example of it among blacks is a game called Playing the Dozens. Have you ever heard about this? Some of you have. They call it different things in different cities in America. I was just in New York and found out there they call it snapping, and I think it was snapping or whatever. It's a game where young blacks, and they still do it all over this country, will stand for hours insulting each other, hurting each other, humiliating each other, attacking family members. That's where the term motherfucker comes from. And then the game is to stay cool, not to get upset or angry, or you would immediately lose the game. Why, basically, are they trying to hurt each other so like that? Well, this is something sociologists have traced back to slavery, in the need of black mothers at that time to hurt and humiliate, especially their male black children, the same way, to prepare them for life in slavery, to make sure that they would never make rebellion against the slave master, because that could get them instantly killed or punished. In other words, it was a survival measure at the time, but it doesn't serve that function any longer. It has been deeply internalized among blacks, and the fact that these traits of internalized racism like that continue 127 years after slavery ended is the best proof we have that slavery never ended in this society. Because these traits we do not see to nearly that extent in other ex-slave societies. I'll get back to that in a second and you'll see it clearly. But let me now put an estimate on the loss of black intellect in this society here. And when I talk about this here, don't forget for 1 minute that this is not scientific stuff. It's just one way to let you understand something most of you never really understood. Let me first say, now, for instance, you're all very liberal here, I can tell. Some would have doubts about me saying this, but basically you are fairly liberal compared to society out there. Yet, deep down, you have developed many of the same gut feelings about blacks, that somehow for some inherent deficiency they can't make it in the school system, and that's why you see so few blacks around you in this school and so on. You are fighting it through guilt, these feelings. You've heard from many of your grandparents these stories about my ancestors came over here dirt poor from this or that country, Poland, Ireland and so on, pulled themselves up by the bootstraps. So why can't they, you would say, talk about the people in the ghettos? And you were more liberal, so you got angry when you heard that kind of stuff. you started defending blacks and say that was because of something in slavery and so on. But basically, you didn't have a good answer at the time. So again, it added to your guilt and anger and so on about this whole issue. But I'll give you some good explanation now you can use the next time you meet that type of grandfather. Say, because let us now put an estimate on the loss of black intellect in this society in relationship to the loss of the white one. As I said, blacks have gone through a much more severe form of oppression, totally being stripped of self-esteem and whatever in this society here. So I would say that maybe as a result of all this oppression, internalized and overt racism, the black growing up in this society might only have 5% left to operate with in a functional way of their vast intelligence at birth. The rest is tied down in all these anger patterns I hope you left with at the end of the show yesterday. Why am I saying 5% here? Simply because, and that's only one way of measuring it, it reflects the overall success rate of blacks in this society now for centuries. Look at this here. This is a white median family income in America. We just put it at 100%. How much are blacks now making in relationship to that? You know?
55?
Yeah, it's probably close to that. The official Census Bureau says 56%. And that's the only reason I say half over here. It doesn't necessarily connect that way. I know that. This was much higher when I first came to America. It was 63%. Blacks are now rapidly falling back with about 1% a year. Basically, this was the same share they had during slavery. At that time, they did not receive money, but food, housing, clothes, and so on. And most whites in the South were poor, so economists have concluded that blacks pretty much had half the living standard of whites. In other words, for centuries there's been no progress for blacks in this society here, economically speaking. We know politically there's been tremendous progress. We now see black mayors all over the place. But economically speaking, no progress. So what does that do to our thinking? Century after century, you hear about all these other immigrant groups who come over here and immediately make it. You think back on your grandfather and so on. And deep down, therefore, you can only come to one conclusion, that somehow for some inherent deficiency in blacks, they can't make it. You're going to be very quiet right now because you all feel this deep down. I've been traveling enough in America to know that whites think that way. And it gives you tremendous guilt because you want to hold on to all these values up here, we're all equal and so on. So this makes you despair because we want to see we're all equal. We want that. We're not bad racists. We don't want to hold blacks back. Some older generations might have wanted that, but basically we want them to be like Bill Cosby. That's why we love that show. It's a dream world we would like to see come true. So we despair when we see this relationship between blacks and whites century after century. And therefore I'll now try to give you some hope. And the hope we get when we start looking at those blacks who are making it. Who are they?
Entertainers?
Yeah, Bill Cosby. Well, they are making it, but basically they belong to the same group here. This is the average of Bill Cosby way up there, and other class blacks down here. Bill Cosby, so rich he could give 20 million to Spelman College. The average. So let me now say it a different way. Those blacks who have not been shaped by our racism, who could they be? Where are we? We're in Ohio, so you might not know.
Blacks in an all-black society, or like areas
Yeah, well, if they're not been shaped by our racism, they have to come from other societies. Because all blacks in this country have been deeply shaped by our racism. all women in this society have been deeply shaped by our sexism and so on. There's no way they could avoid it, you know. So, I'm especially talking about those blacks who came from the Caribbean, West Indian blacks. How well are they doing in relationship to this whole thing here? You don't know. They make up 94% of white median family income. Now, when we look at this here, don't forget that 1% of whites, the Rockefellers and that type of people, own and control 30 to 40% of the wealth in this society. Most of those people did not work their own way up there. They inherited their wealth. So if we allow ourselves to take away that 1% of whites who did not work their own way up, you'll find that the West Indian blacks are completely on the level of whites in this society. And they all worked themselves up from poverty. Nothing was given to them. And this figure here, 94%, includes the recent boat refugees from Haiti, coming here from one of the poorest, most illiterate, oppressive societies on earth. The minute they're in America, or at least the generation after, they're up in the middle class. To the astonishment of Native American blacks in Miami, Liberty City, they don't understand how can they do it when we can't. This is what we have to try to understand here. Why it is so easy for foreign blacks to come here to make it up the ladder and not for American blacks. Well, how should we start it? Most West Indian blacks are living in an area from Washington, New York, Hartford up to Boston. Almost all the top black positions you see in that area, or the great majority of them, are held by West Indian blacks. Some of them you also know nationwide: Shirley Chisholm, Harry Belafonte, General Powell, the chief of all our armed forces right now, West Indian blacks. Republicans have no problems getting along with West Indian blacks. They don't get along very well with American blacks. Well, if you walk into, a lot of the West Indian blacks are living in Brooklyn, in New York. If you as a white person walk in there, you immediately feel, wow, even though everybody's black, it seems like you are in an ethnic white neighborhood, Italian, Polish, whatever type of neighborhood. You see clean streets, thriving business, hardly anybody on welfare, proud home ownership. West Indians are staunchly opposed to welfare, and more young people in college than are in prison. But then you walk into the Native American areas, black areas, in Harlem, Bronx, other parts of New York, and you immediately see the stereotypical white racist ghetto image we have in our home. Dirty streets, broken glass and litter in the streets, burned out stores. In many ghettos I go to these days, like Detroit for instance, almost the only stores that are left in the ghetto are liquor stores owned by outsiders. Up to 40% on welfare, and more young people in prison than are in college. Now we start understanding the tremendous damage we're inflicting on American blacks. So you see now that what we're talking about has nothing to do with race. Because those black West Indians, they came from the same tribes in Africa. They went through the same type of slavery, namely the Anglo-Saxon form of slavery, which was vicious. But there was one difference. What was the difference? That their slavery ended 120 years ago. It never ended in America. What happened after slavery ended in the West Indies was that most of the whites left their islands. So from now on, the blacks could start to recoup all that which was stripped from them in slavery: dignity, self-reliance, pride, and so on, which the American black has never been allowed to recoup again. Plus, they started seeing black role models all over in their societies, and that is extremely important for the motivation of black children. So, when they, a century after, come into this very racist society in America, that you can say they come here as recovered human beings. And even though this is a very racist society, they somehow can now use it as a vehicle for success. It doesn't seem to hold them back. Talking about the Haitians, for instance, you heard all this rhetoric from your parents about white Protestant work ethic, right? That's almost a slogan in this country here, you know. Well, you've never seen anything like the black Catholic work ethic of Haitians coming here holding 2 or 3 jobs at the same time while going to school at night. And that is, of course, how they make it.
I don't ask this the intention of being skeptical.
Well,
I just want to, huh?
You're supposed to be.
Well, yeah, I'm just, so I understand this. Why do you suppose then that that Haiti and like the Dominican Republic and stuff like that, with the absence of generally of white people, is the societies are so poor?
Well, simply they belong to the third world. Whether those countries are white or black, Latin America, they are part of the whole colonial era we ended up with, of poverty, you know. So they're trapped in a totally different a system of colonialism, neo-colonialism, whatever. You know. So that's the only reason I'm saying. Now you're going to see something interesting here. Now let me first show you another thing. What was it? That was... Yeah, one thing I noticed, there's often a deep division between West Indian blacks and Native American blacks in those ghettos. Are there any from New York here? Or Hartford or whatever? Because then you'll know a little bit about this. Of course, West Indian blacks, for whom success came very easy to, relatively speaking, don't understand American blacks very well. So they start thinking of American blacks often in the same racist ways as we do. Therefore, you see a strong clash between them in the ghettos. In Hartford, many of my black American friends, they call the West Indians for go-getters or black Jews. How many are Jews here? Well, that's not many. But let's just play on anti-Semitism for a second and to get a better understanding of this. Black Jews, what does it mean? Namely, the notion that Jews are successful in business, because the West Indian blacks own and control most of the business in the black ghettos out there. Also in New York, whenever you walk into banks in New York and see blacks in the banks, try to go up and ask them if they're from the West Indies. You'll find that it's almost always the case. They're very successful in the financial world. So that's why we're just playing on anti-Semitism for a second, the notion you all have of Jews being successful in. What happened to Jews over 2,000 years? Well, for 2,000 years they were forced to flee into new countries, and often invited by the rulers, the kings, or whatever dictators we had in those societies, to make up an entering wedge between the rulers up here and the masses down here. A low-level anti-Semitic propaganda was kept alive all the time. So if rebellion suddenly broke out against the rulers up here, they could manipulate the anger of the masses out against the Jews instead of against the real oppressors in society. And thus the Jews were forced into pogroms and Holocaust and forced to flee into new countries. The whole vicious history they went through. And often invited by new rulers in those societies to make up the same tiny function in that society, often the only jobs they were allowed to hold in those days in the financial world. That's why the whole notion came there. But throughout the whole oppression, the Jews were somehow able to escape internalizing the worst aspects of Gentile oppression. They came from a strong cultural background, so they could constantly tell their children that you're better than your Gentile oppressors. But this is a vicious, oppressive society, so you must work twice as hard as everybody else to make it up here all the time. And therefore somehow they were able to do that by pushing their children with all kinds of techniques, Jewish guilt and whatever we have, you know. And this is very similar to what happens to the West Indian blacks. They come in here to a very racist society and almost use racism as a vehicle for success. They tell their children that you can do it, but you must work twice as hard as everybody else. And therefore they can't do it and continually make it. And one way they especially make it is, of course, through education. And now you're going to see something very interesting here. How many blacks are there in America? You should know that. Well, you're waiting for the census statistics to come out now. So 30 million this year. Last year it was 29 million. How many of those are West Indian blacks? That you don't know. 600,000. So, in other words, what is the percentage of this? 2%, isn't it? I was thrown out of high school, I'm not good at math. 2%. They only make up 2% of the black population in America. But one thing I and Tony Harris, we got astonished by very soon when we started traveling in America. When we go to the most elitist competitive schools in America, Ivy League type of schools, we soon found that up to 80% of the black students in these very elitist schools, where the SAT scores are very high, are West Indian blacks. 80% of the black student body in those schools are West Indian blacks or have one parent who's West Indian. That seems to make the difference. They make up only 2% of the black population out there. So what are we doing to American blacks to effectively screen them away from a good education in this society? Why can't average American blacks easily make it into Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and so on, when it is so easy for blacks from other countries to do it? This is the damage our racism is inflicting on American blacks. And until this minute here, most of you had learned very effectively to blame the victim for that process. You knew this was happening, but somehow you just found all these rationalizations for it, that this was some inferiority and so on, whatever. This is a result of our oppression. You see now it has nothing to do with race. The West Indian blacks are as black, or even blacker than American blacks. So therefore what we see in this society is generally this. Black and white children enter in the same, together down here on the same level pretty much, in first grade. On average, whites make it up to college. Black American children start getting affected by internalized racism very early. And after fourth grade, it starts coming out in the open. And therefore, they start falling behind in the school system. They lose attention, get inattentive, hostile, turned off, and all this, as they lose hope. That lack of hope is so devastating. If you have no hope, there's no way you're ever going to make it in a society. So after fourth grade, they start to fall behind the whites. And then this becomes a self-fulfilling process. They fall further and further and further behind the whites. And by the time they should make it into college, not to speak of Ivy League schools, they're so far behind that there's no way the great majority of them can get accepted. And therefore, they have long ago learned to live with the street and end up in prison, especially for a man. West Indian blacks apparently follow this one all the way up here. They have no problems. This is the curve of oppression we have in all societies. Let me just say that wherever we have segregation between races and oppression, you'll find that the group being oppressed fall behind generally. in educational system. In Israel we see it between Sephardic and European Jews, or Jews and Palestinians. In Malaysia between Chinese and Bumiputras. In Denmark, where I'm from, between the Danes and the Turkish and Arab children, they fall behind in the school system, etc., etc. Everywhere we see oppression, this is the case. Yet, all Americans have somehow learned to think of this in terms of blaming the victim, not ever to see it as a result of oppression. You had a question?
Yeah, even if West Indian blacks don't have this sort of internalized racism, are they really along the curve exactly the same with whites? Because they must encounter external forms of racism, even if...
Yeah, they don't seem to get defeated by it. So here we're making rough, sweeping generalizations, because I know quite a lot of West Indian blacks who are certainly also affected by it, you know. But somehow, economically, on average, they're still up here. And actually, since they're included in this figure here, American blacks are further back here, further down, because this figure down here is being dragged up by the successful West Indian blacks, you know, who are almost twice as successful, economically speaking. But the interesting thing is that it seems to, even though they have lived here for 2 or 3 or 4 generations, they seem to be able to maintain that gap down to American blacks and not getting devastated by racism. Who understands all this? I don't. It's I wish more studies had been done on it. And the interesting thing is also that it seems to be the case if just one parent is West Indian, then that is enough to give them the push there. The American blacks cannot easily push their children because they have very little expectations of them to begin with, having never had any hope for themselves and so on for the most part. It's very hard to send the message to the children that you can make it if basically you feel that you can't make it. You know, I'll get back to this in a second, because we also have reverse situations where blacks are on top and whites falling behind. That's a more interesting.
I just had a real quick question.
Yeah.
Getting back to the advancement of Caribbean blacks.
Yeah.
Do you have any information, or did you witness any more of the 2% black-white interracial marriages in the United States, where the majority of the blacks marrying whites were Caribbeans as opposed to Native American blacks?
Absolutely,
American blacks?
absolutely.
Yeah.
The intermarriage rate is much higher among West Indian blacks, and mainly because they seem much more similar to white culture in this. Even though they're shaped by a different society, it's much easier for them to fit in on a white side of the spectrum here in America. So again, this has nothing to do with race. Actually, I'll come back to this in a few minutes. I'm going to go on a journey around the Caribbean, and then you'll see some of this. You know. Because now what I'll do is to take you on a little bit of a foreign journey to see how damaged we've really become in this society. We are deeply damaged growing up, whether you're black or you're white in this society. All of us were crippled in various degrees. And to really see that it's easier to see yourself when you see yourself from the outside. So what I'm going to do now is to take you first to a country where blacks are making it and whites are falling behind. Have you any idea what that country could be? You heard something about affirmative action and reverse discrimination in this country. Have you ever seen reverse discrimination in America? You can't have that in a country where whites are solidly on top everywhere. It's impossible to reversely discriminate against whites. But we do have systems or countries, or at least one country where we see that. Down in eastern Costa Rica, you know where Costa Rica is, because I know Americans hardly know anything about geography, you know, all the statistics. Well, this is a school where you probably should know. In the 1870s, after slavery ended in West Indies, in Barbados, Trinidad, a lot of freed slaves came over to work for United Fruit on the Atlantic coast of Costa Rica. And little by little they started buying up small plots of land, and by year 1930 many of them had become affluent landowners. And then we saw a migration of poor whites coming out from the highlands of Costa Rica to look for work out there. So suddenly we see a reverse situation where black employers are giving work to poor whites. That's something you have almost never seen in America. And once it's a system of oppression has been set up, it tends to get worse, just like everything became worse in America between blacks and whites. So what you see there now today, it's something that has really astonished anthropologists who come down there and examine this situation. They'll sit around with these affluent, cultured blacks and listen to what they're saying, and listen to some of the things they're saying. When they sit around and talk about the poor whites whom they have to hire, they often talk about them this way. When I meet two whites at night, I immediately cross over to the other side of the street. Whites are prone to violence, whites carry knives, whites will backstab you, don't ever trust whites, you know. Or the best one is, whites are oversexed, they've got too much sexual drive. That's what the blacks feel about the whites now. Well, you know very well that this is completely the reverse of the stereotypes we have in this society here. But what happens to the poor white children in that society who are forced to internalize all these negative perceptions of them very early? Well, they fall behind in the school system. The blacks make it on average up to university, the whites fall behind, don't make it, and some of them even go to prison. They stay back on the plantations. As I said, once it's a system of oppression has been established, it tends to get worse and worse. And the blacks have now become so rich that they do the same as rich people all over Latin America. They send their children to be educated in the United States. And quite a few will then come up and tell me this, because when I see this, so I know how many of them actually are here in this country. You know that a lot of these schools, like this one, private, small schools, every year they fly out to the Caribbean, Bahamas and so on, to recruit what they call qualified blacks. Don't forget that out in those countries are only 5 million blacks in total. But out of 30 million American blacks, these elitist schools in America can't find enough of what they call qualified blacks. See the problem we have in this country? We're putting so much devastation on American blacks. So some of those that recruit out there are from Costa Rica. Well, if you ask black parents in Costa Rica, what do you hope for your children? They'll usually answer something like, I hope my son will become a lawyer, a doctor. If you ask white parents, what do you hope for your children? They'll usually say, I hope they'll survive. Completely the reverse of parent expectation in America. So this is a system of reverse oppression. And it's so important that we understand that this is also possible, because I want you to never think of this in racial terms any longer, but only in terms of oppression. Until now, we did the same mistake as a frog sitting in the bottom of the well here. We looked up at the sky up there and concluded the sky is no bigger than the opening of the well. We had no better information in this society. We came to a conclusion that this is how blacks are and this is how whites are and so on. We had no better information. What I just did here was to show you a little bit of the sky which was denied you in your upbringing, the information that was denied you in your upbringing here. That's why I can never blame any American for being racist, because we had no better information in this society. Anyway, this is of course just as unhealthy a society. So I'll right now show you another Caribbean society where blacks and whites come out more evenly. Any idea which one that could be?
Cuba?
Yeah. And it has nothing to do with communism. But it's hard for you in America to hear that when Cuba always sounds like communism in your ears, you know. No, this is something that started long before Castro, namely in the Latin form of slavery experience the blacks went through there, just like in Brazil. What happened during slavery in the Latin form of slavery was that the Catholic Church stood between the master and the slave and protected the slave family from being sold away and broken up and executed and so on. In other words, from the beginning there was some psychological escape for the slaves. They were defined as human beings. In America they were solidly defined as property, as things you could destroy and execute and sell away and so on. In my opinion, it has never left the black and white American awareness. So out of that slavery came a totally different post-slavery system in Cuba. And that I felt, my son there was with me in Cuba, we felt the minute we walked down the streets in Havana. Every group of persons we saw, or let's say more than 5 people, would be totally integrated, white and black. Every neighborhood, totally integrated. There was none, or seemed to be none at least, of these guilt-fear tangles in the white mind we know from all American whites, and none of these anger hostility patterns in the blacks as we know from American blacks. They got along completely like this. In fact, last summer, or 2 summers ago, a Cuban black was translating my show to Spanish. And afterwards he then asked me, shouldn't I do the narration also? And then I, with all my American racism, immediately said, no, you can't do that. Because I made my show for whites, and I say we whites all the time in the show. And people can, of course, hear you have a black accent. He said, not in Cuba. There is no detectable speech or behavior gap between whites and blacks in Cuba. You can't tell on the radio who is black and who is white. You know, in America, as racism grew worse, racism lessened up until 1975. The gap between inner city speech and suburban white speech lessened also. I don't know if this shows it very well. Studies have shown that between black speech and white speech. After 1975, when racism started getting worse in America again, black speech now became more different from white speech, increasingly. So we grew more and more different from each other again. In other words, when the more oppression in society you have, the more the people you oppress become different from yourself. This is something we know from anti-Semitism also. Back in old Russia and Eastern Europe, the Jews were extremely different from the Gentile population. Anybody could tell a Jew in miles distance, you know. In this country here, we can hardly tell the difference between Jew and Gentile any longer. Anti-Semitism is so much less here, and therefore we become more alike each other. And that is sort of what you asked that question earlier, you know, sort of tying into that whole question. Once you have not so much oppression, then we of course become all mainstream, you can say. I hate to say white, but mainstream, whatever society we're living in. So what are the implications of this? I went to the hospitals in Cuba and checked with doctors and nurses and found out that blacks do not have a higher incidence of high blood pressure rates than whites do. You know, this is the case in America due to stress, tension, anger, racism, self-destructive eating habits among blacks. They suffer a tremendous high incidence of high blood pressure rate, which kills them much faster than whites. So, but that was not the case in Cuba. So if you do not have all this anger in the blacks, how well are they doing in the school system? I went to the university and found out that blacks and whites enter in the same proportion in first grade as they come out in the university level. There was nobody falling behind like we see it in America, on average between those two groups. Tests were written. There was no affirmative action programs. Tests were written. You couldn't tell who was black and who was white. Wow, that was shocking to me. Why? Well, one thing I've noticed, when I get letters from many of my poor black friends in America, I am astonished to how bad they often write. The oppressed mind cannot verbalize itself very well in written form. Again, something we noticed in our school system, if we went to integrated schools, and we blamed the victim for that. But why was I shocked? Should I have known all this? Of course I should. I have learned a lot about oppression in this society, but no matter how much you know about oppression, no matter how liberal you are in your thinking, I could explain all this stuff, all at any time, to anybody I met in my traveling, at least in recent years here. It took me some years to start to understand all this. But, you know, if you live long enough, as long as I had, in a society like America, where all you see around you, on average, is this black defeat, black failure rate. Deep down in your guts, you do the same as all other white and black Americans do. You start developing these lingering fears of feelings that somehow, for some inherent deficiency in blacks, they can't make it. No matter how much you understand about oppression. And suddenly, when I came to a society which at least on that level was free, I realized how racist I had become in America. By seeing my own shock to this, that the blacks are not falling behind there, have no problems writing and so on, verbalizing themselves. Gee, that's a scary discovery, because I knew very well that the feelings that if you have that type of racism in you, where you somehow deep down expect a group to fail, you're going to, in your everyday behavior, signals, messages you send out to black children in that society, send the message that you're not going to make it. And they're going to pick up the signals, and therefore they internalize them. We know it from teachers everywhere in the world. The expectations a teacher has of a child is the image the child adopts of itself, and therefore eventually becomes as a result of that oppression. Everywhere in the world we see that. So through my racism, I had helped to force millions of blacks into ghettos, and ultimately, therefore, into prison in this society. I was never going to blame any Ku Klux Klan person any longer for that process. So it's very important that we understand our own racism, and it often is not easy before you see other societies, because it is a strange society to live in here. So